this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And today I'm going to continue my conversation on the subject of persistence and perhaps some other things that may get thrown into it. I hope you're having a lovely day. As you know, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and for the most part, they'll show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. Yesterday, we had Chris Copeland as our guest, and we were talking about some of the things coming from CorellianPublishing.com. And one of the big ones, of course, is Reverend Don's book of Stones, Metals, and Crystals. We also have the Witch Wars Defense Manual, Volume 2, How to Win, and a number of other things that we've been talking about quite a bit lately. And watch for us talking more about them. Today, I thought I would continue my conversation about persistence. Yesterday, September 4th, was the founding day of the Corellian tradition, celebrating 145 years this year, and also the founding day of witchschool.com, celebrating 23 years. And I mention this in part because it's directly relevant to the subject of persistence. And with either one of these things, why have they lasted so long? And the answer is we persist. If we look at, well, let's look at Witch School. Oh, and hello to Mary Hawk in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. There were so many times that the Witch School road was a very hard road. There were certainly times it would have been tempting to step aside. We never did. We continued working on it. It continues working now. Some days it works better than others. Some days it needs more work than others. We continue doing it. Persistence is not giving up just because things get hard. Why did the Corellian tradition survive so many generations? And I'll tell you, there were times it almost did not. But in the end, we persisted. And if sometimes that weight got very heavy, we found new ways to balance it and went on. And hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. This is what persistence comes to. Persistence, on one hand, can be a very joyful thing when you just keep doing that next right thing and you enjoy it, but can also be a very difficult thing because, it's also on the days that you don't feel like it, you've still got to do it. When you're not really feeling it that day, you've still got to do it. And this is very often the difference between survival and extinction, between success and failure, whether you're willing to keep going when it's difficult. And in talking about leadership, and again, whether it's just leading your own life or leading an organization of some sort, there are going to be times it's going to be difficult. And what are you going to do? Ideally, you will persist. And even when it's difficult, you will do what needs to be done as best you can. And sometimes it will fail. And then you pick back up and you continue persisting. It is important, as I've said in other programs, to make sure that you're persisting with relevant things, because sometimes, particularly within a larger project, there may be things that have served their purpose, and it isn't necessary to continue those into the future. It may be necessary, in fact, to replace them with something more relevant to the present day and present circumstances. That's an important part of this too. But you don't stop, you adapt, you change, you go on. Part of me feels that perhaps I'm persisting too much in talking about persisting, but it is, in my opinion, one of the most important things to discuss in this subject. I have been described as, and described myself as, a grinder, meaning day after day I grind it out. There are lots of days when I need to do This broadcast, and maybe I'm not really feeling particularly up to it, but it must be done. I do sometimes run best of broadcasts, but it's usually not because of how I'm feeling, but because I'm somewhere else and can't do a live broadcast. And hello to Jessica in the chat room. If I'm here and able to do it, I generally will do it. And I will hopefully know what I'm going to talk about, but even if I don't, I will find something to talk about. I will find the way to go forward. And when we talk about both our daily lives and the projects that are dear to us, the organizations that are dear to us, this is very, very important because there will always be those times when you want to stop. You want to say, I've had enough. I can't do any more. I did my best. But very often, to actually go ahead and stop is not the right thing to do. You have to find the strength to go forward. And if I look back over the 45 years of my career as a pagan leader, and if I look back over that 17 years of constant witch wars that I frequently refer to, um, from more or less 1990 to 2007, and I look back on the people that I found myself in conflict with in those years, I'm not going to find most of them now. Um, Most of them are gone. I am still here. Why are most of those people gone? Well, a lot of them just died. I can talk about persistence all I want, but when you die, it's a little hard to keep persisting in worldly things. I am a great believer in the ancestors. I do believe that we can still be involved in the things we care about on the other side, but it's not the same. But a lot of them also simply dissolved when they got what they wanted. Most commonly, when they got what they wanted, rather than not getting it, they fell apart. And this happened for various reasons, but a lot of it, I would say, in the end, was that they no longer realized how important it was to continue to persist. They thought they'd done what they needed to do. They thought, um, well, at least I achieved so and so, and they stopped. Maybe they thought someone else was going to take over and carry forward. And in some cases, that did happen because not everyone that I remember from those years is gone, but a lot of them are. And hello to Bonnie in the chat room. And Bonnie says, sadly, that's how it all works. Yes, it is. It is. This world is about keeping on, keeping on. It's about many other things. It's about learning. It's about experience. It's about love and all those things. But it's also about keeping on from day to day. Leadership very often comes down to being willing to keep on from one day to the next. And of course, there are so many other things. I'm speaking of persistence, but I've also spoken about relevance. You must keep yourself relevant. You must be open to change because when I say persist, I do not mean persist unchangingly. I mean continue your efforts and continue to keep them relevant to the audience you wish to reach, to the people you want to interact with. Maybe in your life, thinking of the people you want to interact with as an audience isn't the term you would use. Especially if we're talking about your daily life. The people in your life, they are an audience. But maybe that's not the term you'd like to use. Um, maybe even in talking about a leadership position, audience isn't the term you would want to use. But in a manner of speaking, everyone is a performer. We're all on stage, and it's all an audience. It's all a matter of how do I effectively communicate what I want to say? Um, Even if you're just talking to a couple of people um, that you interact with in your life, you are expressing yourself and they are receiving a message. That makes them an audience. I think because of my particular background, I often think of it that way, but I think maybe it would benefit you to think about it that way too, um, because it changes how you plan your communications. And, you know, it's often very important to say what you want to say in the most effective manner. I've talked about things like interfaith language before, that if you're speaking to people from a different background, you want to make sure you're using language they can understand. If you're speaking even to people who are good friends, make sure you're using language they can understand, because the meaning of the message ultimately lies with the person hearing the message more than the person saying the message. What the person saying the message means in the end is only known to them, or the person receiving it, depending on how accurately they have conveyed it. And using language that can be understood is vitally important to doing that. It's also important sometimes to not say certain things. Um, Not every situation needs a comment. Some situations greatly benefit from silence. And then at the other extreme, there are times that you must make certain that you do say what needs to be said. Um, I am far better as a person in not saying certain things than I am in saying them. Um, but both of these things are important because sometimes, you may think the other person understands what you're trying to say, or that something doesn't really need to be said. And long after the fact, you'll find out, oh, that was not the case. They really didn't understand what I was trying to say. If only I'd been more clear, things would have worked out differently. So being clear in your communications, um, but also mindful of what you are saying, this is all very important. And when we talk about persistent, persistence in a relevant and effective way is what's important. And hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. There are so many things to say about this that, I could go on about it indefinitely. Um, but, well, and I probably will. But all of these different things are vitally important to making sure that you say what you want to say. And in the end, a lot of the meaning of our life is part of our communication. The relationships we've had, the effect we've had in the world, all of this depends on communication. And there are many ways to communicate. And one is not necessarily right for everyone, but finding the effective way for you to communicate is very important. And then being persistent with your communication. It's also worth saying that, persistence is very important, but you also have to make sure that you do not become annoying with your persistence. Um, you have to keep it, again, relevant and palatable for people. If you're saying the same thing over and over and over again, eventually people will turn you out. You have to find new ways of approaching it, relevant ways of approaching it. You have to keep your message fresh. You have to keep it something that they will want to hear. And this, when you think about it, it is on one hand a very complex subject. On the other hand, not so terribly complex at all. Many, many years ago, I studied commercial art. Now, if you're under a certain age, you will never have heard that term because no sooner had I finished studying it than as a field it ceased to exist. And it was replaced by graphic artists very different thing. Um, but what was commercial art really about? It was about communication. It focused particularly, but not exclusively, on advertising. But there were so many important lessons involved in this, including one of the most important ones when you're trying to speak to a large audience, whether it's through an advertisement or through a program like this. It's very important to gain and keep their attention. And ideally, you must do it right from the start. In making an advertisement, you have a few seconds through to the people who may see it. And if you don't do that, it's not going to be effective. I remember when graphic arts took over, they seem to have forgotten a lot of these things for the first several years. And I would see big billboard ads that were using lettering so small that you could not see it from a distance. It therefore failed. Still today, I'll sometimes see ads that don't specify what they're about. They're obviously meant to make the viewer curious, and presumably there's an answer somewhere else. Um, there's a billboard here in Danville. Have you called Jenna Worth? But it doesn't tell you who Jenna Worth is or why you'd want to call her. I consider that to be a pretty ineffective ad. After some time, I've come to realize there are other billboards in town that do supply those answers. But, somebody has to be very curious to be going around looking for billboards to find the answer and remember it from the last time. I get the idea. I don't think it's the most successful idea. I think you really need to say what you plan to say, at least enough to get people's attention right off the bat. And I'm a great believer in that idea that once you've lost their attention, it's very hard to get it back. Possible, but not easy. And with that, we are at the halfway point in our half hour, and we're going to take a moment to hear from our sponsor. And I have to, there, no, I have to find there's our sponsor. And now we shall hear from our sponsor. And thank you to Equinox Learning Hub, our sponsor for today. And speaking of persistence, um, running that daily ad is an example of persistence. Repetition can be very important in making a point. Now, Jessica says, "Dear Lord Don, I seek your guidance on navigating this witching war. It seems to me that we engage in a form of spellcraft, communicating with words that hold deep meaning. How does this dynamic influence cancel culture? Specifically, how can one move forward in a situation where one group's opinion overshadows another? Um, I come from a place of harm reduction. I'm sober and working to rebuild my life. I have a therapist and am addressing my basic life needs. I know I'm not alone in feeling this way, but I'm struggling to express it clearly. Thank you for your insights." So, if I understand the question, it's how to move forward in a situation where one group's opinion has overshadowed another, which of course is the whole point of witch wars. And my answer to that is, first, don't worry about the other group. Do not engage with them. Do not deal with them. Focus on your own message and find ways to regain people's attention. And what you may want to do is make it a point not to go to the same old people. Look for new people to speak to. Look for new ways to get your message out there. These are the things I think I would recommend. Above all, stop worrying about what other people think. And it may take you a while to regain lost ground, but you certainly can do it. Look for perhaps highly visible ways to regain um, people's attention. And as far as the witch war goes, outlast it. It really, in a lot of ways, is just that simple. Now, if you want more detailed advice, I would highly recommend the Witch Wars Defense Manual, Volume 2, which will be coming out from Corellian Publishing in October, or you might want to look at Witch Wars Defense Manual Volume 1, which is available free of charge at Corellian Publishing as a PDF, which talks about some of the older techniques for witch wars. And but a lot of it, witch wars are only effective when the attacker can get lots of people involved in it and can get them to react from emotion rather than other sources. Um, and I think that what I have said will be the most effective way of dealing with your situation. But let me know what happens, and perhaps we can have more advice for you. Um, Sometimes in this kind of witch war situation, you may need to answer whatever nonsense is being thrown at you. Often it's better to simply ignore it. And quite often, depending on the nature of the situation, if you ignore someone's attempt to damage you, they will just continue to spiral farther and farther out of control and become crazier and crazier in what they're saying until it's obvious to everyone that they're just trying to attack you and not actually trying to say anything true or meaningful, um, because they're desperate for the attention. So generally, my advice is to not get caught in it, to keep doing the next right thing, to go forward. And again, you may need to find new ways to gather attention, new ways to introduce yourself to people, new ways to speak to people. Um, um, and Bonnie says, until they need you. Well, that can be a thing too. Um, One of the things that I have found looking back at many of these witch wars is that these people who would launch them felt the most important thing was destroying whoever they had decided was their enemy. And when they actually did so, if they did, um, or if they couldn't but were able to go off on their own, they simply fell apart because they had nothing else. Um, it's one of the reasons that it can be wise to ignore it. Bonnie says fear. That's what witch wars subsist on. And if we look at the culture wars in our wider community, that's what they subsist on also. Um, the so-called culture wars are entirely based on fear and hate. And hate, of course, in turn is based on fear. Um, and the people who try to pursue those culture wars do so by trying to outrage and terrify as many people as they can. And that is largely what witch wars are about, too. And it's unfortunate that so often people let themselves be controlled by their fears. And if you are a witch, one of the wise, as we like to call ourselves, you shouldn't be controlled by your fears. Yes, you're still human, you'll still have fears, but you should be able to rise above them and move beyond them. That's what shadow work is all about. And yes, we're always going to fall into our fears. and we'll fall into resentments and all those other human emotions. But we must also be able to rise above them to go forward. Um, it's very rare that the next right thing to do is be afraid. It's very rare that the next right thing to do is to be resentful. Not to say that you can't have those feelings, but that doesn't make it the thing to do. Um, and Bonnie says, I always say, I know my boss, which I assume that means that, to your own self be true. And this is true. Um, to yourself, to your higher power, however you perceive it, in the end, that is where you must be true. Now, Jessica says, I agree wholeheartedly, and that's why I don't understand the need to hate on another group. Well, I hate to tell you, the need for it is a political technique to gain power. And generally speaking, when you see somebody attacking someone else in the pagan community, understand that's what they're doing. They may say, well, I'm pursuing this principled whatever, but they're really trying to gain power. There are a few exceptions, um, but you should always take it with a grain of salt when someone is attacking someone else. And it's rarely a good idea to involve yourself. I won't say never, but rarely. And hello to Anna Elizabeth in the chat room. Um, and there is a long message there. And I will leave that to Anna and Jessica. But generally speaking, it's best to persist in doing that next right thing. Now, sometimes you're not always going to know what the next right thing is, and sometimes you'll do the wrong thing. You don't get depressed about that if you can avoid it. You look at it and say, well, that wasn't what I should have done. What can I do now? I'm a very outcome based person in my thinking. And my advice is always don't get caught up in your emotions, although being human, there are times you will, there are times I do. But continue to look for the next right thing you can do. Continue to look for what will help you in the long run, what will bring you to where you want to be, what will support the things you want to support, and do that. And with that, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. Um, I want to thank you for joining me. And um, I do want to take a moment and repeat a message that I have said before, that if someone comes to you um, unsolicited, saying that they are a psychic and have a message for you, be very careful of that, because legitimate psychics don't do that. Um, and Bonnie says the best and highest good is not always the outcome we want. Well, that's human. Um, but it's always better, in my opinion, to work for the best and highest good, because your good is part of that. And ultimately, we want a better world for ourselves and across the board. But with that, I want to thank you for joining me. If you are interested in a psychic reading, I am available for readings. You can book one at CorellianPublishing.com, or you can email me at donlewishp@aol.com and set one up. We're nearing October. I am planning to do a series of seances this year, as I normally do. You might be interested in one of those. Let me know. And with that, um, I will also recommend you to my Patreon at revdonlewis.com, and then let us have our prayer as we always do. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. We rejoice in this walk we walk together, and we ask you to help us to stay in a positive state of mind and to persist in doing that next right thing, to persist in moving forward as best we can as human beings. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and from respect, knowing you are always with us, still we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always.